Hello, welcome to tonight's WBUR's virtual event, Climate Resilient Cities, and Earth Day discussion of SeaLevel Rise. I'm Amy McDonald, the Director of City Space, with a few housekeeping notes. We are streaming live from the WBUR City Space YouTube channel, and if you haven't already, we encourage you to subscribe so we can notify you whenever we go live. We'd like to thank both trustees of the reservations and New England Aquarium for their support tonight. The trustees of the reservations One Waterfront is an initiative with a vision to provide thoughtful, manageable, and equitable solutions to Boston's climate resiliency goal. The New England Aquarium envisions a downtown waterfront that is climate resilient, equitable, and inclusive, where all residents and visitors feel a sense of belonging. The support of these two institutions has made tonight's event possible. I'm delighted to turn it over to Barbara Moran, WBUR's Senior Producing Editor of our Environmental Reporting team. All yours, Bob.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. And hello to everyone tuning in to this live stream tonight. Today's Earth Day. Happy Earth Day, everybody. In 1970, 51 years ago, activists organized to demonstrate against the industrial development, which they said had left a growing legacy of serious human health impacts. Tonight, we're going to focus on one aspect of climate change that impacts human health and safety, and that wasn't on the radar so much during the first Earth Day in 1970, and that's sea level rise. WBUR is in Boston. The sea level here is about 6 inches higher than it was on the first Earth Day in 1970, and the rate of sea level rise is speeding up. We're certainly not the only coastal city with too much water to deal with. So what can we learn from other cities? What strategies are they using to deal with sea level rise? What works, what doesn't work, and what is the future of coastal city life? We're going to dig into all these questions tonight with experts from Boston, New Orleans, and San Francisco. And let me introduce the people who will be joining our discussion. Rachel Cleetus, hi Rachel, is the policy director with the Climate Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists here in Boston. She leads the program's efforts in designing effective and equitable policies to address climate change and advocating for their implementation. Welcome, Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Angela Chalk is the founder and executive director of Healthy Community Services, a nonprofit located in the 7th Ward of New Orleans. The group works in collaboration with other area organizations to provide residents and business owners with an understanding of urban stormwater management techniques and how the drainage system of New Orleans works. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you, Barbara.
Kristina Hill is an associate professor at the University of California, Berkeley. She studies urban ecology and hydrology in relationship to physical design and social justice. Her primary area of work is in adapting urban districts and shore zones to the new challenges associated with climate change. She currently focuses her research on adaptation and coastal design in the San Francisco Bay Area, but engages in comparative studies in the US, Mid-Atlantic, Europe, and Hawaii. Welcome, Kristina.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Before we get started, the conversation would be incomplete without your questions from the audience. You can send them to us all throughout the evening by going to slido.com. You can go on your phone or on the internet, slido.com, and you enter the event code CLIMATE and ask your questions. And we'll get to many of those as we can. Okay, so I wanted to start because we're all from different places around the country, and some of us may be more familiar with some places than others, with grounding us in each of the places we'll be talking about tonight. And as I was preparing for this event, it was really interesting to me how many similarities and differences there were between these 3 cities. So we're going to start with Boston. And what's really interesting about Boston is, well, I think it's interesting, is that it started out, 400 years ago as a peninsula, right? With all these tidal flats around us, and people made more land by filling in these tidal flats. And that affects what we see with the problems with sea level rise today in Boston. All of those areas that used to be tidal flats and that people filled in are now the areas that are prone to flooding. And Rachel, can you tell us just a little bit about Boston, and then I'll go to you, Angela and Kristina, about your cities. Just give us the brief snapshot about Boston and what we're facing as far as sea level rise in the coming decades.
Sure. As you mentioned, Barbara, the key thing when you think about Boston is this city that has grown out through fill. And when we look at sea level rise projections, when we look at maps of where the risks are and where the threats are, what's striking is you almost see the city within the next few decades retreating back to the original skeleton of what it was. So it's like nature taking back from what it was before. And the fact is we're already seeing the leading edge of these changes in our city already. One way we see it is when we have these storms and you see the water come really far in, as we saw with the storm Grayson a few years ago. But the other way we're seeing it is just regular high tide flooding getting worse, sunny day flooding, tides that are now riding on higher waters because of sea level rise, so they're reaching further in. And then if you live in the Boston area, you've seen this around the Seaport District, for example, where regularly during the year, there are these photos that'll be in the newspaper that look almost futuristic. Seeing the leading edge of the risk, and it's definitely getting worse, accelerating and getting worse as we look out.
Yeah, and it's also this, increased rainfall and increased hurricane strength, which I know has on down there. I mean, you guys are surrounded on all sides by different bodies of water.
Yes, we have similar to Boston. The land that we sit on is a result of the sediment flowing from the Mississippi River watershed, and as it comes down, it carries all the sediment that then enters into the Gulf of Mexico. And what has happened because of sea level rise, our shore is vanishing, which leaves us vulnerable to more intense and more frequent hurricanes, which thereby erodes our coast. And it's unique in the fact that our coast is both a line from Mississippi to Texas. And so the impacts of that is the fact that the Mississippi River is now controlled by levees. And so the sediment is unable to build up land.
Edge of San Francisco, bringing down the highway that goes along the coast there. It sometimes erodes back as much as 20, 30, 40 feet in a weekend. So that's been a big deal.
No, wait, say that again.
Yeah, there have been a couple storms where we've lost big chunks of the bluffs on Ocean Beach.
Wow.
And now they're trying to keep that beach nourished with more sand so that it won't erode so quickly and waves can't cut away at the bluff.
Wow.
So that's the ocean side. It's bad. On the bay side, there's a lot of flat land that's very valuable all around the whole bay. And San Jose is actually a larger city than San Francisco now. And Oakland is our third city in terms of population size. So we have a lot of urban area, very valuable land. Every little bungalow is worth $1 million now. And the flat land next to the bay also has high groundwater. And at sunny day flooding, not only do we see the tide, the salt water coming in onto roadways, but we see water coming up, bubbling up out of manholes. And that's groundwater coming up through our storm system.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit more about that, because I think when most people think about sea level rise, they're thinking about, like you said, the ocean coming in and knocking down the bluffs and knocking over highways, and here comes the ocean on the coast. But there is this other issue with groundwater, like you said, bubbling up, and that's sort of affecting a lot of other stuff in all of these cities. So Kristina, do you want to talk a little bit more about that? And then we'll go to Rachel and Angela.
Sure, I've pantomimed this many times. There's the sea level rising, and there's the freshwater groundwater on top of the saltwater under the land. And as the sea rises, it puts pressure on that and it rises above. So the whole thing is coming up together. And most of our coastal defenses were designed for temporary high water on the saltwater side. But as groundwater rises, it's going to come up on the land side, the water. So our levees and things are not going to work for
right.
that.
Huh. So
pantomime.
So what, and I think that is causing a lot of sort of problems that most people don't expect. Rachel, can you talk, or Rachel or Angela, who wants to talk a little bit about that?
I find that interesting. I'm sorry, Rachel, but I find that
Please.
interesting that you all are having an issue with groundwater, where we need a groundwater table that's higher to for us to avoid subsidence, and so that's unique to the typography of our country, and to have we would love to have that problem in Louisiana, coupled with and for us, the sea level rise is occurring because of the waves from the wave action from the Gulf of Mexico. And while we have what we call living shorelines in place to help reduce some of that erosion, we know that we can't battle the ocean side or the Gulf side of those barrier islands, but we can begin to protect and shore up the side that's closest to the land, and that is occurring. I mentioned earlier that we use that by recycling oyster shells to create those barriers, and of course we use sand as well. But that's interesting that that you're having a groundwater problem. We would love to have that problem.
Well, it's coming up for you too, Angela.
Yeah. Scientifically, I know that that's true, but just the thought of having dry flooding, that's frightening as well.
Rachel?
Yeah, just building on what Kristina just mentioned, this is where we start to understand the limits of hard infrastructure, gray infrastructure, in keeping out sea level rise, because that water is going to come up from underneath. And we see an extreme version of it in places like Florida that have porous substrate that really has it coming up very quickly. But that is a problem wherever here on the East Coast we have sea level rise. And in a city like Boston, it's combining with a few different things. We're a relatively old city. We have a lot of aging infrastructure underground, and that includes our stormwater systems, et cetera. We have a lot of combined sewer overflow systems that are dumping out into the harbor with sea level rise. What happens is you've got the water coming up, and when you get a lot of a heavy rainfall event with a storm, you get this situation where that water is no longer going out. It's backing up into the system and spilling out into the streets. So as sea levels rise, this is going to become a bigger and bigger problem in many places that have these kinds of old systems. The other thing that we're recognizing is, like in any big city, even apart from sea level rise, the fact that we have so much impermeable area doesn't allow the water to go anywhere and be absorbed. And over time, our development patterns have also eroded what used to be the things that would protect us, the marshes, the wetlands that would blunt some of this erosive capacity of the water coming in. Now, of course, there's a tremendous effort underway in Boston to try to safeguard some of these resources going forward, but we've lost a lot, and it does mean that we're more vulnerable to sea level rise creeping in. And we have so much, Boston's a very forward-looking city in a lot of ways. We recognize this risk, but we have so much existing infrastructure and buildings in these places that are exposed, electrical substations, subway systems, and a lot of toxic stuff. Any old city that's had a lot of industrial sites and development, there's a lot of stuff there that when you have flooding and sea level rise gets carried in, all these toxic wastes get carried into that water. And so we have some Superfund sites in the Boston area, as do many places around the country. Places like that are vulnerable, to carrying those toxics into communities and affecting health, people who live in those communities.
Angela, do you have that same issue in your cities as far as these sort of old buried oil tanks and Superfund sites and getting flooded? Do you see that?
What we have in Southeast Louisiana is because we're an old city as well. We have in Southeast Louisiana are the abandoned oil wells from the oil and gas industry, or the pipelines. So those create issues, and I know that there's legislation now to address those issues and to still tax those companies that have those abandoned oil wells, because they're looked at as no longer being assets, but indeed they are assets because they're a part of infrastructure. So I know that there's legislation to review that and perhaps tax that, so that those industries or the owners of those of that infrastructure can be held accountable. The other thing with us in New Orleans is what's unique is that we have to pump our water out. Nowhere else in the country does anyone have to pump water out of the city in order to help reduce flooding. And that's why when I told Kristina we would love to have that infrastructure, that high water table, because we have to use nature-based solutions, using native plants in order for those plants to get down to that water table to help reduce some of the runoff of flooding that occurs in this area. And so again, it's going to take all of us, industry, businesses, organizations, and people, to realize, the assets that we have here and how do we manage those assets strategically in order to save our coast. Kristina, you mentioned the time frame that the land is disappearing. Well, in Louisiana, we lose a football field of our coast an hour, and Louisiana has lost so much land that it would be the size of the state of Delaware. And so that's impactful to people who live not only at the coast, but in more urban settings. As we lose the coast, we lose the culture of folks who live in those areas.
I want to talk a little bit more about that, just building on what Rachel and you, Angela, both said about who is impacted by both these, the flooding and the sort of leftover infrastructure and leftover toxic waste stuff, and as well as these other groups, these indigenous groups near New Orleans that are also affected. And a lot of the sea level rise is going to be more heavily impacted in environmental justice communities and communities of color. And can you talk about any sort of specific examples in your cities about who this is hitting hardest and why?
I'm sorry. I thought you were talking to me. I apologize. So I'll state about the community of Ile-de-Jean-Charles. Literally, that community is being engulfed by the Gulf of Mexico, and it's the largest FEMA relocation for a community in the history of our country. And so how do you ask the indigenous people to leave their land, the connection that they have to the land that will soon become the sea? So you're leaving culture, you're leaving family, and then where do they go? Where do you relocate those families to? And certainly as they move inland, the impacts that it has on the communities that they're relocating to in the way of increased population, increased density of housing, increased traffic, increased schools. And so those are things that I don't think that folks really take into consideration when we look at sea level rise and the impact that it has on all communities and people.
Maybe I can give an example from San Francisco. At Hunters Point Bayview, which is a historically African-American neighborhood in San Francisco, they made ships, and the Navy used ships and painted ships with radioactive materials that did a good job of glowing in the dark. I guess that was handy, but it's left the soil contaminated with radioactive materials. And across the bay, Richmond, where the Rosie the Riveter Museum is, they also have radioactive material right next to the shoreline in uncapped landfills, unlined, uncapped. And benzene and toluene. And both of those areas are places where workers lived in the 1940s who worked in the shipyards, and their families still live there, even though the industrial jobs are mostly gone. and they're African American, Latino, recent Asian immigrants. It's a really diverse community, and it's some of the only affordable areas left in the Bay. And there's a lot of pressure to build new housing there at higher density on actually contaminated sites where the ocean is coming up and the groundwater is moving everything around again.
Yeah, and in the Boston area, Barbara, a lot of those places that you were describing that were created through fill have a number of neighborhoods that are low-income neighborhoods with communities of color. There was a recent study by Climate Central where they were looking at affordable housing all over the country and where it's located. And the reality is that because of our country's history of structural racism, a lot of times where people are living has a lot to do with where they were able to live. Mm-hmm. And Dorchester, for example, in this Climate Central study, they found that a large part of Dorchester could be underwater by the end of the century because of its vulnerability for where it's built. The study also talked about a little more than 1,500 of the state's affordable housing units at risk of floodwaters reaching those buildings once a year on average. And that number is going to triple in the next 30 years. So what this means is that we simultaneously have longstanding structural inequities in where and how we've allowed people to even own homes and live. And now we have that colliding with this additional layer of risk with climate change. So it's compounding that risk. And that's why you get this disproportionate impact often with low-income communities and communities of color. Another place here in the Boston area is East Boston, which most people in Boston really only know about because they go to the airport and they drive through it. Seriously, a lot of people have never walked around East Boston. When I first moved to Boston, I lived there. It's a lovely neighborhood. And the thing is, Logan Airport is very fortified because of the investments that have been made. Even though it is a very low-lying airport, it does certainly have vulnerabilities, but a lot has been invested in fortifying it. Whereas the surrounding neighborhood in East Boston, which is primarily a low-income community, a community of color, has not received those kinds of investments. And there is a lot of vulnerability to flooding. And we have this phenomenon happening now where these very expensive condos are being built on the edge of the water there. Those condo buildings have, the electricals have been elevated. They have more investment in some of these floodproofing measures, but the surrounding neighborhoods have not had the resources to make those investments. So again, this is something that the mayor of Boston, Mayor Walsh, who just has moved into the Biden administration, really was aware of this and understood that more investments needed to be made in these communities, that they had to be prioritized. But we've got a long way to go. And meanwhile, people are experiencing these impacts already starting to see these impacts.
We have a couple of questions coming in for the audience, but I want to just follow up on that before I go to those. I want to talk about rich people, because you're saying okay, well, it's gonna flood, whatever. We'll build a high rise, we'll put the air conditioning on top, and we'll be fine. And it's like there's just this whole climate gentrification thing happening, and Rachel just described it happening here in Boston. Can Angela and Kristina, can you talk about, is that happening where you are too, and how are they? What are all the rich people doing there? Angela, go ahead. What?
Yeah, of course it's happening here. I'm gonna use it for instance in the Treme neighborhood, which is just west of where I live at here in the 7th Ward. Let's say 15 years ago, a residence there may have cost, $60,000 to $100,000. Today, that same property is upwards of $800,000. And that's one of the oldest communities in our country that afforded African Americans to be property owners. And so gentrification definitely is happening. And then as community organizations, what we just found out, as community organizations help those moderate to low income folks put in green infrastructure interventions, it's increasing their property such that they can't afford the property tax that's being assessed to them. And we're trying to mitigate the issues of flooding. So it's a catch-22 situation. I mean, you either flood and be bought out because someone can purchase your home really cheaply, or you are pushed out because of gentrification and you can't afford to live in a community that is just as old as the city of New Orleans, which we just celebrated our 300-year anniversary. So what's sort of like what came first, the chicken or the egg? And it is creating problems for people of color in our communities. And so to date, with the collaborating partners with Healthy Community Services, we're managing 50,000 gallons of storm water per event across 3 neighborhoods. Now, that's a significant amount of water because it makes a difference as to whether or not you can get into your house, physically walking into your house, or even being able to drive to get to your home. And so we see gentrification occurring along with short-term rentals throughout the city. So yes, and folks don't have a vested interest in these communities. They're here temporarily, or developers are here to make $1, and they're going on. They don't have to worry about the escalating cost of flood insurance or any of those things that working people have to be concerned with.
Mm-hmm.
Kristina?
We, the whole Bay Area has already seen extraordinarily high house prices. So every 2-bedroom single family is more than $1 million. You just can't find a 2-bedroom single family for under $1 million now. So, almost 2 here in Berkeley, 2 million. So we are now thinking about how to bring that wealth into the infrastructure and how to get new housing to protect other people. And we're learning this from the Dutch, that you can give the rich lovely homes in the stormwater infrastructure. Like, they could float in a stormwater pond and be very happy. And you have the ultimate monitoring device because they will drop a dime if something looks like it's going wrong. So you put the entitled people in the innovative infrastructure that protects other people, and I think that's a formula for American adaptation.
Do they tell the rich people they're floating in a stormwater pond, or is there some nice name for it?
It will be evident. In the Netherlands, they just have a high groundwater area that they use to direct stormwater to in a big rain event. And in that high groundwater area, they've sold wealthy people homes that are cantilevered over the water or actually floating in the water. So they get a beautiful waterfront property, and the community gets to pay for its new stormwater infrastructure, partly through the real estate fees applied to wealthy people's homes.
So interesting.
See, now you want to make me research that model so that I can bring that here to Louisiana.
I'll send it to you in an email.
Yes, please do. Which was interesting because with the Louisiana Strategic Adaptation for Future Environments, there was consideration of making Grand Isle a floating city because of, as you may know, Grand Isle is the city in Plaquemines Parish are the areas that bear the brunt of any storm that comes to Southeast Louisiana. So people did look at that, but that would be interesting to see, Kristina. Send me that. You're gonna put me on another mission now.
So a couple audience questions. There's 2 that are related here, so I'll ask. So one is about this question of entrench or retreat, which is, and you touched on this a little bit, Angela, about the relocation of that one community. And what are your thoughts? There's sort of 2 related questions. One is, should people be penalized somehow for building in coastal areas? And what do you think about the idea, the flip side of that, of somehow getting people to retreat from coastal areas where there's a development? And how is there a way to do that equitably and fairly? Or I don't know, like how do you see either of those playing out, and what might be some pluses, pros and cons of those things?
Firstly, the folks are not choosing to build there, to live there. People have lived there for hundreds of years before Louisiana was even discovered, are claimed by the French. So people are not moving there to build property there. And so how do you ask someone, and this was a big question after Katrina, why go back there? How do you ask someone to leave their ancestral grounds where all their culture is rooted in there, the history? How do you ask someone to leave that? Eventually, because of sea level rise and literally being swallowed up by the Gulf, you can't become entrenched unless you put in a housing, sort of like Kristina said, floating cities. But that may be 15 years down the line. And I'll use the example, and I posted it on Twitter. So you have all of these ancient burial sites of communities that live there that have just eroded into the Gulf of Mexico. So now I no longer have a connection with my ancestors if I want to visit them. So when I hear people saying that, know that wherever you live in this country, wherever it is, you're going to have a problem. And how would you feel if someone asks you to leave your home? We are connected culturally to our family, our food, and our faith in Southeast Louisiana. So it's not a matter of just picking up and moving somewhere else. And so that's insulting to ask someone that. And I know people may not have good intentions about, leaving there, but that is insulting to those of us who live in Southeast Louisiana. Respect of cultural norms is the most important thing. Now, we're not stupid either. We realize we can't battle the Gulf of Mexico, but it just takes us longer to realize that we're going to have to leave.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just building on what Angela said, so of course we have the science and the projections of sea level rise, and everyone, including people who are seeing it up close in Louisiana, know what's happening. The challenge is this is a deeply human, emotional problem, and it's on such a large scale. It's, the whole eastern Gulf Coast of the U.S. in some form is facing this kind of a threat. And added to that, I would just note that many communities, especially communities of color, Native American communities, indigenous communities, have no reason to trust the government. So when you have people saying, well, we're going to come up with this plan and it's all going to work out, trust us, it's all going to work out. There's a history here that leads people to think, I don't know, I'm pretty sure I'm going to be on the wrong side of that bargain. Mm-hmm. The other piece of it is that we're still talking about it in a very individualistic sort of way. Take that buyout, move here. Whereas what people are telling us is we're a community. We have a shared history, and our models for retreat right now, except for these isolated examples, are very much about individual homeowners and a very financial decision. Take the buyout, and we have very highly underfunded buyout programs. I should start by saying that too. But the model is not one of a community grappling with a challenge and choosing a vision for its future. That's the conversation we really need to very quickly open up in this country in many places. Bring people in to the dialogue, a stakeholder dialogue about what that vision is for their future and where they'll go, not just what they'll leave, but where is this place that you're telling people to go? And in the absence of that, I have to say, looking around the world, when I see pictures from Bangladesh or parts of the Philippines, you see people who are standing in knee-deep water and still not leaving, because where are they going to go? Where are they going to start from scratch again? What is the option that they have? So I feel like in a country like the United States, a relatively rich country with the luxury of a fair amount of land that could be, say, for higher ground, that we haven't opened these conversations in an equitable way is unfortunate, and we need to get going as quickly as possible. What we can't do, though, is what the science is telling us is the time frames. How much time do you have? And we need to use that time well. And if what we do is just retrench and keep business as usual, then we're not actually creating pathways out of the risk. So I think there's a lot to be learned from community level stakeholder conversations right now, because believe me, the people on the front end of this risk, they know it.
Yep.
They already know it.
Yeah, that's something we've learned from New Orleans, that communities want to stay in place and that they need to stay in place, and that's just. So we're talking about adapting in place, but in phases. So coming up with ways of adapting in place for 30 years, let's say, using conservative estimates, high estimates of where sea level might be, and then, rolling back the carpet in stages and cleaning up as we go so that we don't leave a toxic soup in the nearshore environment that will punish us in the end also. So it's going to take money. It's going to take capital investment to do this adaptation in place, and to do it in such a way that we leave that ground cleaner when it is eventually inundated.
That leads to another audience question, which Angela also touched on before. Kristina, how do we get the polluters to chip in for this, right? To clean up the toxic soup? Why is it the government paying for it? So what are there strategies to make that happen, or has that happened successfully anywhere?
Yeah. Well, with sites that EPA knows who the polluter was, and it's all very clear, they are on the hook. And here in California, in the Bay, there's AstraZeneca's site. It's about 84 acres. It's extremely polluted. It's one of the most highly polluted sites along the Bay edge, and it's right at the high tide line. And they were going to pay $150 million or $120 million to clean up that site. They had an insurance bond, the company. And apparently what's happened is state agencies are lowering the bar and allowing proposals for housing to go on these sites, that particular site, with a lower bar for cleanup. So just cleaning up part of it, not all of it, just little acupuncture cleanup of this very polluted site. So the deep pockets are there, and the government needs to stiffen its spine, cowgirl up. This money from the private sector. We need the public dollars to do other things like, protect highways from flooding, make canals in neighborhoods to protect them. We're going to have to do a lot of stuff on the public side. So where there are deep pockets like AstraZeneca, we need to get their money.
There's another audience question. So this was leading into something I wanted to get at with solutions. And a lot of places, people think, well, we got sea level rise, let's build a wall. People love seawalls and pumps and big gray infrastructure and things like that. And can you all touched on this a little bit, but can you each give me an example of a successful different type of solution that's working where you are, that you could see being a model for other places? Who has a favorite? Go ahead, Angela.
I like the idea of the oyster shell recycling, because it not only gets residents involved. I'm sorry. It's a telemarketer. It not only gets restaurants involved with recycling and doing something for the coast. There are many opportunities for folks to volunteer to come out and have a living shoreline. The other thing that we do here,
people, what do people do with the oyster shells? What are the oyster shells?
The volunteers will first of all, the oyster shells are cured so that there's no living organisms in them, and they become dried. And so volunteers are recruited to pack those oyster shells in biodegradable bags, and then those bags are put into big, for lack of a better word, a net or a metal mesh. And so those metal meshes are then put into the designated area, and it helps to build back the land, creating a natural reef barrier for those areas. The other thing that we do in Southeast Louisiana, all throughout the coast of Louisiana, is recycle Christmas trees. So unflocked Christmas trees are bundled and put into the marsh, and along with the Air National Guard, that's a part of their maneuvers and training so that they can get into low areas. And so it becomes a community event. It becomes a way for people to become incrementally involved to help make that change. And to see those oyster reefs that are creating a living shoreline, and to see the drops of the Christmas trees, the recycled Christmas trees, and then actually visualize and have land rebuilt very rapidly. That's an amazing process. And I invite anyone to come, any and everyone to come to Southeast Louisiana to see that process at work. And so it creates environmental stewards in our young folks and young adults. It creates a whole environmental movement that is equitable for everyone.
Yeah, well, here in the Boston area, I would say there's been a lot of interest in preserving our marshlands as a buffer for storms to help limit sea level rise, but also just it has so many great ecological attributes. It's a water filtration system, it's an ecosystem, it's a recreational space, it's a place for birders. And so there's been a lot of interest in trying to both preserve but rejuvenate some of our natural coastal safeguards to these kinds of impacts. And as a result, what's been really interesting is that in a lot of very urban environments, like in the Boston area, you have a lot of people who are now going outdoors more. And this last year has been terrible on so many fronts. But having these kinds of spaces next to urban areas where people can be outside despite the COVID pandemic and safely engage with nature, there's been a flurry of interest in these kinds of spaces. So I really see the opportunity here to bring more people into a space of talking about solutions that they see give them immediate benefits, even as they help the city grapple with a larger challenge. I do want to say the one thing, though, that is also important is to really open a dialogue about the limits of gray infrastructure, because there is some level of magical thinking about the fact that, oh, you can just build a dike or a seawall and everything's going to be fine. You can keep doing what you're doing. And here in the Boston area, a big project like that has been rejected because the science has shown that it just wouldn't help preserve the city. There was similar to the Dutch style, there was a plan to have this big, massive barrier in the harbor. And there was a study that UMass Boston and Woods Hole did, where they basically said, this just wouldn't, the water would not surmount this kind of a barrier. It wouldn't be effective. And also the cost is incredible. We're talking billions and billions of dollars. And that would only preserve a certain part of the city. So that's the other thing, you would be making a decision that might help preserve some economic asset that people think is important, but most people would be still left exposed. So that's a solution that really can't be deployed in a large way. There might be some places where it might just make sense, but it can't be the solution that we're all looking for in our daily lives.
Yeah, people in San Francisco Bay Area, I was on a call-in show, and every single person who called in said, why can't we just build a wall across the Golden Gate? And, well, first of all, it's 400 feet deep. Second of all, 3 Mississippi rivers worth of volume of water comes in and out that opening every day with the tides. So it's crazy. It would be a Hoover Dam they'd have to build there, and it would be breakable. I mean, that's the kind of thing that fails catastrophically. And the key with adaptation is to build things that can't fail catastrophically. So you can't have to run up to the roof of your house at 2 a.m. and use a hatchet to put a hole in it and get up on top. We learned this from New Orleans. Yes. And we need to do it differently so that people aren't at risk of catastrophic failures. So in the Bay Area, we voted in 2016 to tax ourselves, every parcel, $12, to build wetlands. And our goal is 100,000 acres of wetlands in the next 20, 30 years. We're already at between 40 and 60,000 acres. So we already have the biggest experiment in the world going on in how to restore coastal wetlands. And that works for reducing wave energy. It's like it trips the waves, and the waves don't come as far inland. So it buys you time, but the groundwater keeps coming up. So the future plan is to look at mosaics of ponds, and some of those ponds would have floating blocks, floating urban districts. Some of them would have habitat, some of them would be for paddleboarding, but it has to be a mosaic of these ponds. And as you dig out the material to make the pond, you take the dirty stuff and you sequester it, and you take the clean stuff and you build the wetlands. So we can kind of be like earthworms and rework these big, flat coastal areas in a way that's sustainable, and it gives people some more certainty about how many decades they can be where, because it is all going to have to roll back over the next 100 years in phases. And those phases will be shorter if sea level rises faster, and they'll be longer if sea level rises slower.
Kristina, we all really need to see photos of these things.
Yes, I'm thinking the same thing, Rachel.
It does all sound very San Francisco.
Yeah. I'm trying to imagine what, and you're familiar with New Orleans, what would that look like in communities to have these floating neighborhoods?
One of the things the Dutch have done so far is they've had each 3-story modular structure is floating on its own bottom. Mm-hmm. But their new approach is to have things floating on shared decking. So you might have, 200 modular units floating on shared decking. And that way you don't feel any waves. You don't have to worry about which wall you put the piano on or the bookcase. And it's much less like a houseboat and much more like a regular neighborhood. And the water underneath might not even be visible. It's just a floating foundation under decking. So that's the idea. The Apple headquarters apparently has a section of floating water displacement foundation. And it's good for the Bay Area because we have earthquakes. We don't have hurricanes, we have earthquakes. And floating is a way to have a kind of ultimate displacement from the earthquake energy wave. So we need to use different strategies and innovate in different ways than places that have hurricanes but no earthquakes.
That's so interesting. So
very.
My last question I was going to ask you guys was, and I think maybe Kristina already went on this, is I was thinking about the first Earth Day being 50 years ago, and like since then the sea level in Boston has risen about 6 inches or so. And then I was thinking, okay, then 50 years in the future, so we have the 50-year Earth Day in the future. It's like Boston, so that's 2070 we're talking about. So that Boston, they're projecting sea level rise, and Rachel, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think about 40 inches, 3 feet by 2070 in Boston. And, I love this. Part of me feels like, oh man, we're in big trouble. And then I hear Kristina's vision of floating buildings and, the wetlands, and it kind of gives me hope. So I'm thinking, 50 years in the future, there's going to be another group of 4 people like us talking about sea level rise. And I mean, what's your hopeful vision for your city in 2070? Angela, you want to go first?
Oh, sure. Okay. I'm hopeful for several reasons, and that is that we are starting our kids off young. So 50 years from now, this will be their world to handle. Mm-hmm. What I have experienced, like I spoke of earlier, is the strategic adaptation plan that the Louisiana Coastal Protection Restoration Authority is over, and that what folks said they wanted to see in their communities, and there were 9 parishes that received the funding, what folks said they wanted to see, it was actually appropriated. And so those actions are now taking place as we speak. And so this was a transparent community, public-private relationship, and community folks got to say what they wanted to see in their neighborhoods and how they were looking forward to adaptation based on those 3 levels of risk: low, medium, and high risk for the next 50 years. Had I known this 50 years ago, perhaps I would have majored in environmental science in order to help save our coastline. But it certainly, as a little Black girl in the 60s, I didn't know anything about environmental stewardship, and those things were left to the scientists. That information was kept on the shelves. But now, with the internet and transparency, people are demanding action, and that's what we're doing now. We're demanding action, and we're participating in that action, because no longer is government going to tell communities what it is that they want, our research institutions. It's working with communities, and especially in communities of color and indigenous communities. How are you going to go into someone's neighborhood and tell them what they ought to have? That's unreal, and is just downright disrespectful. And so I see that change occurring, that working with communities is the way for all of us to advance together.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about the Boston area, so the Union of Concerned Scientists, we did some research on sea level rise and chronic flooding a couple of years ago, and we looked at the lower 48 and looked at property that was at risk from sea level rise. And here in the Boston area, by the end of the century, we're talking 89,000 homes worth $63 billion in today's value, and that's at about 7 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. And the reality is the latest science is very sobering, because what we're seeing is that the higher end of the risk around sea level rise is going up. Actually, every time the National Climate Assessment, the 4-year cycle happens, what we see is things like ice sheet loss are happening at a much faster rate than scientists even thought 10 years ago. And we're starting to set off these really scary tipping points around the rate of change. So I guess in the spirit of humility, what I would say is, what I would want most is for us to leave our children and grandchildren choices. Mm-hmm. We can't figure out what they're going to do with those choices. The biggest thing we can do, the choice we have now, is to sharply curtail our heat trapping emissions that are driving climate change and sea level rise. The other piece is, people sometimes start from a position of thinking business as usual is great. And actually, business as usual is already not working for a lot of people. There are a lot of reasons to change where we live and how we live already, because we have these huge affordable housing crises. We have a lot of the legacy of mortgage redlining, all of those things built into our current society, the fabric of our society. So what if, as we were creating options around climate resilience, we were getting to the heart of some of these issues? How did we get here in the first place? And then create those choices and options. And as Angela is describing, different communities will make different choices. Mm-hmm. But we have to marshal the resources. People cannot be left to do this in an ad hoc way by themselves. Every community, depending on whether you're rich or not, or have access and power or not, we have to have a more equitable sharing of the resources and give people a sense of agency. I do think if we do that, I'm very optimistic that we will create the space for people to make choices that both respect the humanity and their deep ties to community and place, but also respect the vision of future and innovation and embrace change and all of those things. Human beings are resilient. But at this point, the scary thing is we're closing off choices by the business as usual path. So I was very encouraged today to hear, coming out of the Earth Day Summit, that the Biden administration is committing the U.S. to 50 to 52% reductions in emissions below 2005 levels by 2030. Other countries are also stepping forward. We really need to come together as a global community, because this challenge that we're talking about today is so local and it's so global. We're all in this challenge together. So I'm personally today feeling more hopeful than I've felt in a long time that the U.S. finally is back in, and we're going to be responsible in addressing this challenge.
Yeah, I think in 2070, the San Francisco Bay Area is all about innovation. And if we can be brave and be bold, and I'm from Boston originally, so I think of Yankee ingenuity. You can't say that in California. But, we need to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and try some stuff that's different. do some pilot projects in the next 20 years, 10 years. And by 2070, we could see both of our major international airports functioning with floating runways. The Japanese have done it in Tokyo. We can do that. And we can have floating urban districts, and we can be living well with higher water, like the Dutch plan to do. And I think that's a perfectly good strategy for us. We can have wetland edges, and we can float on our groundwater, and we can live with this in a really positive way. It's not a Pollyanna vision. I recognize it's a lot of money having to go to it that otherwise could have gone to pay for something else. But we have to be bold, or conventional development's going to fail. So we wouldn't have any airports. We wouldn't have billions of dollars worth of homes. So we have to face facts, see what's coming, and start innovating, or we're going to lose resources and lose tax base and lose people's lives and health.
Yeah. The good thing is, Kristina, is that planners, the students who are studying planning now, they're looking at our future cities both from their planning discipline as well as how it will impact food supply chains. And so all of that collectively, there's hope for us in the future, because our young people are leading that charge by being visionary, and they're not letting the politics of the day get involved in making wise decisions for all of us. So I'm hopeful.
That's good. Nature bats last, so we have to think about that.
Yeah.
They'll make the new politics of the day, I hope.
Yes.
They're very hopeful note to end on. So we are unfortunately out of time, but thank you so much to Rachel Cleetus, Policy Director for the Union of Concerned Scientists, Angela Chalk, Founder and Executive Director of Healthy Community Services in New Orleans, and Kristina Hill, Associate Professor at the University of California, Berkeley. And thank you to you, our audience, for joining us tonight and for all your great questions. Next up, Earthwhile and WBUR City Space team will team up again for a breakdown of President Biden's climate summit, which started this morning, and what that means for Massachusetts. Earthwhile reporter Miriam Wasser will kick things off with a one-on-one sit-down with Gina McCarthy, White House National Climate Advisor, and also Boston native, which we like. And then we'll bring it local with a group of climate experts. Rachel Cleetus will be back, along with State Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs Kathleen Theoharides, Elizabeth Turnbull Henry, who's the president of the Environmental League of Massachusetts, and the Reverend Mariana White Hammond, the founding pastor of the New Roots AME Church in Dorchester, who was also just named the Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space for the City of Boston. You can find out more and register at wbur.org/cityspace. And thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you all, and
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Take care. Bye.